Imagine a woman so close to death that her breath is a wet rattle, her face shattered by the blunt force of a fireman's axe. She cannot speak. She can barely see through the swelling. But when a detective leans over the blood-soaked mattress and asks if her own son did this, she nods. Joan Porco didn't just survive a midnight execution, she delivered a silent testimony that would haunt the state of New York for decades. It was the ultimate paradox, a mother's final, involuntary act of truth against the child she would spend the rest of her life defending. A single nod that sealed a fate and started a nightmare. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Delmar, New York, sits on the southern edge of Albany, a town defined by its proximity to power and its distance from the chaos of the state capital. In 2004, it was a sanctuary of leafy streets and colonial-style homes, the kind of place where a low crime rate wasn't just a statistic, but a point of civic pride. At the center of this suburban idyll was 36 Broccoli Drive, a residence that, by all accounts, housed the quintessential American success story. Peter and Joan Porco were more than just neighbors, they were pillars of the community. Peter, 52, was a man of the law, a distinguished clerk for the New York State Supreme Court's Appellate Division. His reputation was one of meticulous precision and unwavering integrity, a man who navigated the complexities of legal precedent with a calm, intellectual grace. Joan, 54, complemented this gravity with a warmth that made her a beloved figure at the Glenmont Elementary School, where she worked as a children's librarian and speech therapist. Together, they curated a life that appeared seamless, rooted in the values of education, hard work, and familial loyalty. The Porcos had two sons who were the products of this environment. The eldest, Jonathan, had followed a traditional path of service, commissioning as an officer in the United States Navy. He represented the stability the Porcos valued, a clear, upward trajectory. Then there was Christopher, the younger son, who at 21 years old was a student at the University of Rochester. To the casual observer, Christopher was the charismatic charmer of the family. He possessed an easy, effortless social grace and a physical presence that suggested a young man comfortable in his own skin. He drove a bright yellow Jeep Wrangler, a vehicle that became a recognizable totem in Delmar, and he dressed with a curated nonchalance that masked the financial strain required to maintain such an image. However, beneath the surface of the golden boy persona, a profound and pathological rot had begun to take hold. While Peter and Joan believed they were financing a prestigious education, they were actually subsidizing a sophisticated architecture of lies. Christopher wasn't just struggling academically, he was effectively a ghost on campus. He had been forced to withdraw from the university due to failing grades, yet he continued to reside in the dorms, pretending to attend lectures and sit for exams. The psychological disconnect was staggering. He spent his days maintaining a social life built on a foundation of total fabrication, convincing his peers and his parents that he was a high-achieving student on the verge of a bright future. The tension within the Porco household was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, pressurized buildup. Peter Porco, with his legal mind trained to spot inconsistencies, began to notice the frayed edges of Christopher's narrative. The financial discrepancies were the first cracks to appear. Peter discovered that his son had not only forged his academic transcripts to secure a return to university, but had also taken out a $31,000 loan in Peter's name, forging his father's signature as a co-signer. This wasn't merely a youthful indiscretion, it was a profound betrayal of the very legal and moral frameworks Peter lived by. In the months leading up to the incident, the atmosphere in the Broccoli Drive home shifted from one of quiet support to one of mounting confrontation. Peter's emails to Christopher became increasingly stern, stripped of parental softness. He expressed a sense of deep disappointment that bordered on desperation, informing his son that his deceptions had been unearthed and that the financial support was coming to an end. He warned Christopher that he would not be a party to his fraud, essentially giving the young man an ultimatum: come clean and face the consequences, or be cut off entirely. Christopher's reaction to this cornering was not remorse, but a further retreat into his own distorted reality. He began to view his parents not as benefactors, but as obstacles to the lifestyle he felt entitled to lead. The charismatic exterior remained intact for his friends in Rochester, but in the private sphere of his communications with Delmar, the mask was slipping. Joan, ever the maternal protector, tried to bridge the gap, pleading for honesty, while simultaneously fearing the fallout of Peter's looming judgment. The family was standing on a fault line, unaware that the son they had raised was no longer the person they saw in the family photographs, but a stranger capable of calculating the exact weight of a fireman's axe. The disintegration of Cristopher Porco's golden boy persona did not occur in a singular, explosive moment of realization. Instead, it was a slow, agonizing erosion, a paper trail of deceit that Peter Porco, with his forensic legal mind, began to piece together throughout the spring and autumn of 2004. Cristopher's life at the University of Rochester was an elaborate theatrical production, one where he played the role of a diligent student, while the reality was a void of failed credits and administrative dismissals. By the time the final semester of his sophomore year ended, the university had officially disenrolled him due to a lack of academic progress. But to Peter and Joan, Cristopher was still their promising younger son, moving toward a degree in economics. He didn't just lie about his grades, he curated an alternate reality. He intercepted mail from the university, ensuring that the official notices of his expulsion never reached the Broccoli Drive mailbox. He spoke of professors who didn't exist and assignments he never submitted, maintaining a conversational rhythm that seemed entirely natural. The first significant crack in this facade appeared not in a transcript, but in a bank statement. Peter Porco discovered that his son had engaged in a calculated act of identity theft, one that hit at the very core of Peter's personal and professional honor. Cristopher had applied for a $31,000 loan from Greenlink, a private lender, to finance his lifestyle and the upkeep of his prized yellow Jeep Wrangler. To secure the funds, he had forged Peter's signature as a cosigner. For a man who spent his days in the highest courts of the state, ensuring the integrity of the law, discovering that his own son was using his name to commit bank fraud was a profound humiliation. Peter did not react with an emotional outburst. He responded with the cold, precise language of a man who dealt in facts. The financial betrayals deepened with a secondary incident involving an eBay transaction. Cristopher had attempted to sell a high-end laptop he did not possess, pocketing several $1,000s from an unsuspecting buyer. When the victim realized the scam and threatened legal action, the trail led directly back to the Porco residence. Peter was forced to step in, using his own funds to reimburse the victim to prevent a criminal record from tarnishing Cristopher's future. In his communications with his son, Peter's tone shifted from paternal guidance to a weary, clinical observation of a personality he no longer recognized. He began to use a word that would later define the prosecution's case: pathological. In a series of increasingly grim emails sent in the weeks leading up to November 2004, Peter stripped away any remaining ambiguity. He told Cristopher that his behavior was not merely a lapse in judgment, but a deep-seated character flaw. He expressed a sense of mourning for the son he thought he knew, noting that the web of lies had become so dense it was impossible to discern where the truth began. Peter gave him an ultimatum, a deadline that was rapidly approaching. He informed Cristopher that he would no longer be financing his lifestyle, and more importantly, he would not be covering for his crimes. He demanded that Cristopher meet with him in person to discuss how he intended to repay the forged loan. The message was clear. The bank of Peter and Joan Porco was closed, and the protection Peter provided was being withdrawn. Joan Porco's position in this burgeoning conflict was one of agonizing mediation. She was a woman defined by her empathy, a librarian and therapist who believed that any problem could be solved through dialogue and understanding. While Peter viewed the situation through a legalistic lens of fraud and consequence, Joan viewed it through the lens of a mother's hope. She was the buffer, the one who pleaded with Peter to give Cristopher one more chance, and the one who sent Cristopher gentle, pleading messages asking him to simply tell the truth so they could move forward. She couldn't fathom that her son's deceptions were anything more than a young man's fear of disappointment. She didn't see a predator, she saw a child who had lost his way. By early November, Cristopher was effectively trapped. The University of Rochester was demanding proof of his re-enrollment status. His father was demanding the return of $31,000 he didn't have, and the social circle he had cultivated in Rochester was built on the premise that he was a wealthy, successful student. The Jeep Wrangler, the ultimate symbol of his fabricated status, was at risk of repossession. In his mind, Peter Porco had transformed from a father into a prosecutor, a man whose primary goal was to dismantle Christopher's life. The emails between them became a digital countdown. On November 4th, Peter sent a final, stinging message, telling Christopher that he was a disgrace and that the time for excuses had passed. He warned him that if he showed up at the house for the upcoming Thanksgiving break without a concrete plan for restitution, he would be turned away. Christopher's responses to these salvos were masterpieces of gaslighting. He told his father that there had been a misunderstanding at the bank, that the school's administration had made a clerical error with his grades, that he was the victim of a series of unfortunate events. He maintained a veneer of calm, even as the walls closed in. He was a man who had become so comfortable in his lies that the truth felt like a foreign language he refused to learn. While he was telling his mother he loved her and missed her, he was likely calculating the exact moment when the voices of his parents would fall silent forever. The dynamic at 36 Broccoli Drive had become a pressure cooker of unspoken resentment and documented betrayal. Peter was prepared to exercise tough love, unaware that the love had already curdled into something lethal in his son's heart. The stage was set for a confrontation that Christopher knew he could not win through debate. To maintain the illusion he had built, he needed to eliminate the only two people who could see through it. He wasn't just planning a murder, he was planning a social reset. If his parents were gone, the debt, the fraud, and the disappointment would vanish with them. He would be the grieving son, the heir to the family's estate, and the master of his own narrative once again. In the quiet dorm rooms of Rochester, 140 miles away from Delmar, the charismatic student began to visualize the weight of the axe in his hand. The late-night hours of November 14th, 2004, were marked by a bone-chilling dampness that clung to the asphalt of the New York State Thruway. At approximately 10:30 p.m., a signature splash of color moved through the darkness of the University of Rochester campus. Cristopher Porco's yellow Jeep Wrangler, a vehicle that would soon become one of the most scrutinized pieces of machinery in criminal history, pulled out of the dorm parking lot. The distance between the university and 36 Broccoli Drive was roughly 140 miles, a 3-hour journey that bridged the gap between a life of mounting failures and a desperate, violent solution. Christopher's transit was a study in calculated stealth, or at least the attempt of it. Forensic analysis of his movements that night would later center on the toll booths of the Thruway. At 10:45 p.m., a yellow Jeep was captured by surveillance cameras passing through the Rochester toll plaza. The driver was a shadow behind the glass, but the vehicle was unmistakable, modified with oversized tires and a black soft top. The route was linear, slicing through the quiet heart of upstate New York. While his classmates were settling into the Sunday night rhythm of late-night study sessions and dorm room chatter, Christopher was hurtling toward a confrontation he had spent weeks mentally rehearsing. He arrived in Delmar in the deadest part of the night, likely between 1:45 and 2:15 a.m. The suburb was a graveyard of silent houses and parked sedans. He did not park in the driveway. He knew the sounds of the neighborhood too well to risk the metallic crunch of gravel or the heavy thud of a car door under the bedroom windows of his sleeping parents. He stayed on the periphery, slipping toward the house like a ghost, returning to a place it no longer belonged. The security system at 36 Broccoli Drive was a modern sentinel, but it was one Christopher had helped maintain. At 2:14 a.m., the master code was punched into the keypad. It was the family code, a series of numbers that validated the entry as authorized. There was no forced entry, no shattered glass, no splintered wood. The house simply opened its doors to the person it trusted most. Once inside, the first act of the intruder was to move toward the basement utility room. With a pair of heavy-duty snips, the telephone line was severed, an attempt to ensure that if the alarm was triggered, the monitoring station would be deaf to the emergency. Christopher moved through the familiar geometry of his childhood home. He knew where the floorboards groaned and where the shadows were deepest. In the garage, he found the instrument of his resolve, a heavy fireman's axe, a tool designed for destruction, for breaching barriers and breaking through deadlocks. He carried it up the stairs, the weight of the steel and wood balanced in a grip that had once held hockey sticks and textbooks. The master bedroom was bathed in the gray, filtered light of a suburban moon. Peter and Joan were deep in the heavy sleep of middle age, unaware that the air in their sanctuary had just grown colder. The attack was not a conversation. It was an industrial process of elimination. The axe was swung with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. It struck Peter first. The force was catastrophic, shattering the frontal bone of his skull and severing the nerves of his face. Then the blade turned to Joan. She was smaller, more fragile, but the violence visited upon her was just as absolute. The sounds were wet and heavy, the dull thud of steel hitting bone, the ragged intake of air that was no longer a breath but a reflex. Then silence returned to the room. Christopher left the axe on the bed, a signature of the carnage he believed he had completed. He exited the house, reset the alarm to create the illusion that the home had been secured from the inside, and began the 3-hour drive back to Rochester. He was back in his dorm room before the sun touched the horizon, logging into his computer to create a digital footprint, a timestamp of a man who had never left his desk. What followed at 36 Broccoli Drive was a physiological phenomenon that defies conventional medical logic. It is the core horror of the Porco case, the sleepwalking ghost. Peter Porco was not dead, but his brain had been functionally dismantled. The massive trauma to his frontal lobe had effectively performed a crude, violent lobotomy. However, the brainstem, the primal core that regulates basic motor functions and ingrained habits, remained active. In a state of profound neurological shock, Peter's body began to perform the automatic routines of a lifetime. He did not realize his skull was missing a significant portion of its structure. He did not realize the bed was a lake of his own blood. Driven by the sheer momentum of habit, Peter got out of bed. He walked to the bathroom. Evidence at the scene showed he stood before the mirror and attempted to shave. The sink was stained with the grisly mixture of shaving cream and brain matter. He then moved through the hallway, his steps heavy and stumbling, and navigated the stairs. He went into the kitchen. The man who had been executed in his sleep was now performing the chores of a Monday morning. He emptied the dishwasher. He prepared a pot of coffee. The most haunting detail discovered by investigators was Peter's final act of normalcy. He walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out onto the porch to retrieve the morning newspaper. He then walked back inside, placed the paper on the kitchen table, and sat down. It was only then, as the blood loss finally overcame the electrical impulses of his brainstem, that the ghost finally collapsed. He fell to the kitchen floor, his life ending in the very spot where he had spent 1,000 quiet mornings. Joan remained upstairs, a shattered remnant of herself, clinging to a life that had been reduced to a single, pulsing thread of survival. The house was a temple of the macabre, a residence where the daily routine had been performed by a dying man who was already technically a corpse. The blood was everywhere, tracked from the bedroom to the bathroom, smeared on the kitchen cabinets, dripped onto the morning's headlines. As the town of Delmar began to wake up, the yellow Jeep was already back in its spot in Rochester. Christopher was appearing in the common areas of his dorm, yawning, complaining about the early hour, and acting the part of the weary student. He had committed the unthinkable, and then watched his father perform a post-mortem domestic routine, an echo of a life that Christopher had decided was no longer worth preserving. The incident was over, but the evidence of Peter's final, automated morning would become the most powerful testament to the sheer brutality of his son's betrayal. Monday, November 15th, 2004, began with a conspicuous silence at the New York State Supreme Court's Appellate Division. Peter Porco was a man of absolute habit, a human metronome whose presence was as guaranteed as the morning gavel. When 10 a.m. passed without him at his desk, his colleagues felt a prickle of unease. By 11 a.m., that unease had curdled into alarm. Michael Axon, a court officer and friend, was dispatched to 36 Broccoli Drive to perform what everyone hoped was a redundant welfare check. The neighborhood was draped in the gray, mid-morning light of a typical November day. When Axon pulled into the driveway, He noticed Peter's car was still there. The house looked undisturbed, but the silence felt heavy, impenetrable. He walked to the front door and found it unlocked. This was the first anomaly. In Delmar, residents were comfortable, but Peter was a cautious man, a man who understood the mechanics of risk. Axon pushed the door open and stepped into the foyer. The air inside was thick with a metallic copper scent, the unmistakable aroma of a massive volume of blood. He called out for Peter, his voice echoing through the still rooms. There was no answer. He moved toward the kitchen, his eyes scanning the floor. That was when the logic of the world shattered. Peter Porco lay on the kitchen floor near the entrance to the basement. The scene was a chaotic tableau of the mundane and the horrific. On the kitchen table sat the morning edition of the Albany Times-Union, neatly folded. Nearby, the dishwasher had been emptied. The coffee pot was out. Peter's body was a map of unimaginable trauma. His skull was open, the wounds so deep they were structural, yet he was dressed for a workday that would never happen. Axon didn't need to check for a pulse. The sheer volume of blood painted across the linoleum and the cabinets told the story of a man who had been dead long before he stopped moving. Axon drew his weapon, a reflex born of training, fearing the intruder might still be lurking in the shadows. He moved through the house, his boots sticking to the floor. As he ascended the stairs, the copper smell intensified, becoming a physical weight. The master bedroom door was ajar. Inside, the visual reality was worse than anything his mind could have conjured. Joan Porco was in the bed. She was a ruin of flesh and bone. The bedding was saturated, the white linens turned a deep, bruised crimson. Her face had been virtually erased by the axe. Her jaw was shattered, an eye was missing, and her forehead was a cavity of exposed tissue. Yet, as Axon approached, he heard a sound, a jagged, wet wheeze. Joan was still alive. She was breathing through a throat filled with her own blood, a feat of biological defiance that seemed to defy every law of trauma medicine. The call for emergency services transformed the quiet suburb into a staging ground for a major forensic operation. Within minutes, the cul-de-sac was choked with ambulances, patrol cars, and the high-pitched hum of a medical helicopter circling overhead. Detectives from the Bethlehem Police Department, led by Cristopher Porco, flooded the residence. They were seasoned officers, but the sight of the bedroom and the trail of blood leading downstairs stilled their tongues. Porco knew the clock was ticking against Joan's survival. While paramedics worked with frantic clinical desperation to stabilize her, he leaned over the bed. He didn't ask for a statement. He needed a designation. He asked Joan if she knew who had done this. He asked if it was a stranger. She remained still. He then asked a question that would define the next 2 years of legal warfare. Was it Cristopher? In that moment, Joan Porco, a woman with half a skull and no capacity for speech, moved. She nodded her head. A single, deliberate vertical motion. Porco, seeking absolute clarity, asked her again. Again, she nodded. He then asked if her older son, Jonathan, was responsible. Joan shook her head. No. The last nod was not just a gesture. It was a dying mother's identification of her own flesh and blood. As she was wheeled out on a gurney toward the waiting helicopter, the investigators had their prime suspect. The search of the property moved into a higher gear. In the master bedroom, the weapon was found exactly where the killer had left it, on the bed, nestled in the blood-soaked covers. It was a heavy, long-handled fireman's axe, its steel head matted with hair and biological matter. Forensic teams noted that the axe came from the family's own garage. This was an intimate execution. Outside, the perimeter search yielded more calculated details. The telephone lines at the side of the house had been cut with professional-grade snips. The alarm system had been deactivated using the family's secret code, then reactivated as the killer left. There was no evidence of a robbery. Jewelry sat untouched on the dresser. Peter's wallet remained in his pants. This was a targeted surgical strike aimed at the inhabitants, not their possessions. Rumors began to ripple through Delmar like a shockwave. Neighbors stood at their porch steps, watching the yellow tape go up. The news that Peter Porco, a man they saw every morning, had been found butchered, and that Joan was fighting for life, turned the neighborhood into a fortress of fear. The initial red herring of a professional hit perhaps related to Peter's high-stakes work in the court system, was briefly debated among the press. But the police weren't looking at the mob. They were looking at the New York State Thruway. By the afternoon of November 15th, the search had expanded 140 miles to the west. While Joan Porco was undergoing the first of many reconstructive surgeries at Albany Medical Center, detectives were pulling into the parking lot of a dormitory at the University of Rochester. They were looking for a bright yellow Jeep Wrangler. They were looking for Cristopher. The contrast was jarring. While the Broccoli Drive home was a charnel house, the dorm room was a sanctuary of normal collegiate life. When they found Cristopher, he appeared stunned, the very picture of a grieving, confused son. But as the forensic sweep of the house in Delmar continued, a different search was happening, a search for a timeline. Investigators began pulling toll records and security tapes, looking for the yellow ghost that had moved through the night. They found it. At every major junction, the Jeep had been caught, a mechanical witness to a journey of 300 miles and a lifetime of betrayal. The search for the why began as the search for the how concluded. They had the weapon, they had the identification from the victim, and they had the trail. What they didn't have was the realization that the woman who had nodded Cristopher toward a life sentence would soon become his most vocal advocate. The investigation into the carnage at 36 Broccoli Drive began with a profound sense of institutional betrayal. Because Peter Porco was a high-ranking official in the New York legal system, the initial instinct of the Bethlehem Police Department was to look outward, at the vengeful shadows of the courtroom. The red herring of a professional hit or a disgruntled litigant took hold of the early hours. Detectives combed through Peter's recent cases, looking for anyone with enough stored-up malice to cross the threshold of a private home with an axe. Rumors of organized crime involvement rippled through Albany, fueled by the sheer brutality of the scene. But the forensic reality quickly dismantled the mob hit narrative. A professional assassin does not use a family's own garden tool. They do not leave the weapon behind, and they certainly do not take the time to meticulously reset a residential alarm system. This was a crime of intimate geometry, an execution performed by someone who didn't just know the house, but belonged to it. The focus shifted from the courthouse to the Rochester dorm room with a speed that felt like whiplash to the Delmar community. While Joan Porco lay in a medically induced coma, a team of forensic accountants and digital investigators began dissecting Cristopher's life. They found a man who had been living in the negative space of 100 different lies. The $31,000 loan was the cornerstone of the motive. Investigators discovered that just weeks before the attack, Peter had sent a series of emails that were essentially legal briefs for a father-son divorce. He had told Cristopher that his signature on the Greenlink loan was a forgery, and that he intended to notify the authorities if the matter wasn't rectified. In the cold language of the law, Cristopher was looking at a felony charge initiated by his own father. To the police, the timeline was undeniable. Peter was killed not for what he did at the Supreme Court, but for what he was about to do at the kitchen table. The search for physical evidence proved to be an exercise in the absence of things. There were no fingerprints on the axe handle, no DNA from a struggle, no forced entry. To a seasoned detective, this didn't suggest a lack of a suspect, but rather a suspect with a profound understanding of forensic protocols. Cristopher was a student of economics and a member of a high-achieving family. He understood the concept of cross-contamination. However, he had failed to account for the mechanical witnesses that defined the New York State Thruway. The investigation centered on the yellow ghost. Detectives began the grueling process of reviewing thousands of hours of surveillance footage from toll plazas between Rochester and Albany. They hit a breakthrough at the Rochester toll booth. At 10:45 p.m. on the night of the attack, a yellow Jeep Wrangler with a black soft top, a vehicle identical to Cristopher's, was recorded entering the Thruway. At the Albany exit, 3 hours later, the same vehicle was captured. The return trip was even more damning. At 5:12 a.m., a yellow Jeep was seen heading west, back toward Rochester. The driver had used the fast lane transponder, a device that Peter Porco had paid for, and which was registered to Cristopher's Jeep. The digital breadcrumbs formed a straight line from the dorm room to the murder scene and back again. When detectives interrogated Cristopher's roommates and fellow students, the charismatic facade began to crumble under the weight of specific time frames. Cristopher claimed he had been in his dorm room all night, watching a movie and sleeping. But the university's network records told a different story. His computer, which was usually active deep into the night, had gone dark during the exact window of the drive to Del Mar. There was no outgoing traffic, no keystrokes, no activity. He had tried to create a digital alibi by leaving his computer on, but the lack of interaction was a loud, echoing void. Furthermore, classmates recalled seeing the yellow Jeep missing from its usual spot in the parking lot during those critical hours. One student specifically remembered noticing the empty space because the Jeep was such a conspicuous fixture on campus. The psychological profile of the investigation began to paint Cristopher as a master of compartmentalization. He had spent the morning after the attack appearing calm, even helpful. When the police finally brought him in for questioning, his demeanor remained eerily stoic. He spoke of his parents in the past tense before their deaths had even been officially confirmed to him. He expressed concern for his mother's condition, but his body language lacked the physiological markers of grief, the elevated heart rate, the dilated pupils, the involuntary tremors. He was a man performing the role of a grieving son, but the performance was too polished, too rehearsed. The community's reaction to these developments was a mixture of horror and a dark, voyeuristic fascination. Del Mar was no longer a sanctuary, it was a fishbowl. The sight of the yellow Jeep, once a symbol of youthful energy, became an object of loathing. Parents looked at their own children with a new, unspoken anxiety. If a boy like Cristopher Porco, raised with every advantage, loved by a woman as kind as Joan, could do this, then the concept of suburban safety was an illusion. Rumors began to circulate about Cristopher's past, stories of small thefts and manipulative behaviors that had been dismissed as boys being boys, but now looked like the early symptoms of a sociopath. The investigation's most contentious pillar was the nod. As Joan Porco slowly emerged from the fog of trauma and multiple surgeries, the legal battle over her vertical head motion began. The defense team, led by high-profile attorneys, argued that Joan's nod was a result of extreme neurological shock and suggestibility. They claimed that Detective Bodish had led the witness, that a woman with a shattered brain could not possibly deliver a reliable identification. They brought in medical experts who testified that the trauma of an axe to the frontal lobe would render any cognitive response meaningless. But the investigators stood firm. They pointed to the fact that Joan had specifically shaken her head no when asked about her older son, Jonathan. She had demonstrated a capacity for discernment. The last nod became the emotional and legal epicenter of the case. As the months turned into a year, the frustration of the Bethlehem detectives grew. They had a mountain of circumstantial evidence, but the lack of smoking gun DNA on the suspect himself was a hurdle. Cristopher had been seen cleaning his Jeep with an intensity that suggested he was trying to scrub away the very molecules of the night. He had disposed of his clothing. He had maintained his innocence with a chilling, unwavering consistency. Yet the paper trail of the $31,000 forgery and the toll booth timestamps created a cage of facts that Cristopher couldn't charm his way out of. The investigation concluded not with a confession, but with a realization that the primary victim had now become the primary defender. Joan Porco, despite the nod that had initially condemned her son, had spent her recovery period rewriting her own memory. She began to publicly support Cristopher, appearing in court with her face still scarred and her eye covered by a patch, standing by the man the police were certain had tried to erase her from existence. The social echo in Del Mar reached a fever pitch. Was this a mother's unconditional love, or was it the final, successful manipulation by a pathological son? The detectives had done their job. They had traced the axe and the Jeep. Now they had to convince a jury that a mother's first instinct was the truth, and her second was a tragedy. By 2006, the weight of the evidence forced the legal proceedings out of Albany to Orange County. A change of venue granted because Cristopher's face and his yellow Jeep had become too toxic for a local jury pool. The trial in Goshen was a clinical dissection of a shattered family. Prosecutors presented the digital trail of the Greenlink loan and the throughway timestamps as a closed loop of guilt, while the defense fought a losing battle to have the last nod suppressed as hearsay. They argued that Joan's brain was too traumatized to be a reliable witness, but the prosecution countered with the surgical precision of the alarm deactivation. Cristopher remained a study in eerie composure throughout the testimony, showing no visible emotion even when the autopsy photos of his father were displayed. The jury deliberated for 36 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on second-degree murder and attempted murder. During sentencing, the judge remarked that Cristopher was a person of profound, calculated coldness, handing down a term of 50 years to life. The golden boy was finally unmasked, leaving the courtroom not as a student, but as a convicted matricide. The nod on that November morning was a reflex of the dying, but the life that followed was a masterpiece of denial. Joan Porco emerged from the hospital not as a star witness, but as a mother who had chosen to bury the truth alongside her husband. She stood on the courthouse steps, her face a map of the violence he inflicted, telling the world she loved the boy who shattered her life. Cristopher Porco sits in a cell today, a man defined by a single vertical motion of his mother's head, a gesture she spent the rest of her days trying to take back. Love didn't just blind her, it became her final, silent sanctuary. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.